Hey guys, welcome back. Go ahead and dim the lights, maybe grab a glass of water or settle under that heavy blanket. Tonight, we're going to drift through some of the absolute strangest, most chaotic moments in human history, starting with a story that proves that even if you're dead, the paperwork never really ends. We're traveling back to the late ninth century, a time that historians affectionately call the Saculum Obscurum, or the Dark Age of the Papacy. It was a time when being the Pope was less about divine guidance and more about surviving the next 15 minutes. But before we get into the trial itself, we have to talk about the man of the hour, Pope Formosus. Now, Formosus is a great name. It actually means good looking or well formed. Whether he lived up to the name is debatable, but his life was essentially one long, exhausting headache. He was a bishop first, and he was actually quite good at his job, which, as it turns out, is the worst thing you can be in ninth century Rome. If you were competent, people hated you. If you were incompetent, they also hated you. It was a very lose-lose era for the career-minded cleric. Formosus spent years traveling, doing missionary work, and trying to navigate the shark-infested waters of the Carolingian Empire. At one point, he was actually excommunicated by a previous pope, John VIII. Imagine that on your resume. Reason for leaving last job, forbidden from ever entering a church again. But Formosus was a survivor. He eventually got his excommunication lifted, worked his way back into the good graces of the Vatican, and in 891, he finally landed the big chair. He became Pope. Now you'd think that would be the peak of his story. He's the Pope. He's elderly. He's tired. He probably just wanted to sit in a nice chair and look at some manuscripts. But Formosus made the classic mistake of getting involved in Italian politics. He crowned a guy named Guy III of Spoleto as Holy Roman Emperor, mostly because Guy had a large army and Formosus didn't. But Formosus didn't actually like Guy. He thought the Spoletos were a bit too grabby with church lands. So he secretly invited another guy, Arnulf of Carinthia, to come down and liberate Italy. This is where the drama starts to simmer. Arnulf comes in, kicks some Spoleto butt, and Formosus crowns him emperor instead. The Spoleto family, specifically a woman named Agiltrude, who was effectively the matriarch of the clan, wasn't exactly thrilled. She was the kind of person who held a grudge like it was a holy relic. Formosus eventually died of old age in 896. He probably thought, finally, I can get some sleep. But in the ninth century, death was merely a procedural hurdle. Enter Pope Stephen VI. Stephen was a Spoleto puppet. He was young, he was angry, and he was likely a little bit unhinged. Agiltrude whispered in his ear that Formosus had been a traitor, a usurper, and a generally bad vibe. She wanted revenge, even if the target was 6 feet under. And so, Stephen VI decided to do the only logical thing. He decided to sue a corpse. In January of 897, the Cadaver Synod began. Stephen ordered the body of Formosus to be dug up. Mind you, he'd been dead for 9 months. This wasn't a fresh body. This was, well, let's just say he wasn't Formosus anymore. They took the remains, dressed them in full heavy papal vestments, the tiara, the silk robes, the whole 9 yards, and propped him up on a throne in the Basilica of St. John Lateran. Imagine being the guy whose job it was to dress the corpse. That's a career low point. The trial was a spectacle of the absurd. Stephen VI stood there, screaming at the silent, decaying body. He accused Formosus of perjury, of violating canon law, and of being a fake pope. Because Formosus couldn't exactly defend himself, Stephen appointed a young deacon to stand behind the throne and answer on the dead man's behalf. I want you to picture this deacon. He's standing in a room that smells like a nightmare, hidden behind a rotting pope, trying to mimic the voice of a man who died nearly a year ago while an angry pope screams in his face. It's the ultimate, this could have been an email moment in history. Why did you usurp the See of Rome? Stephen would shout. The deacon, probably trembling, would squeak out a defense. I didn't. I was called by God. The whole thing was a farce, of course. The verdict was decided before they even picked up the shovels. Formosus was found guilty on all counts. As a punishment, because apparently being dead wasn't enough, Stephen declared all of Formosus's ordinations and acts invalid. This threw the entire church into a bureaucratic meltdown, because if Formosus wasn't a real pope, then all the priests he ordained weren't real priests, and all the people they baptized weren't actually saved. It was a massive theological oopsie. But they weren't done. They stripped the body of its robes, chopped off the 3 fingers on his right hand, the ones he used for blessings, and dragged the body through the streets of Rome. Eventually, they just tossed him into the Tiber River like a piece of unwanted furniture. Now, this is where the story gets a bit spooky for the superstitious locals. Rumors started spreading that Formosus's body began performing miracles after it washed up on the banks of the river. People started saying the statues in the church bowed as his body passed. Whether that's true or just the result of some very stressed out Romans having hallucinations, we don't know. But what we do know is that the Roman public eventually had enough of Stephen VI. It turns out that putting a corpse on trial is a bit of a PR disaster. A few months later, Stephen was stripped of his papacy, thrown into prison, and strangled. It was a very live by the sword, die by the strangulation kind of end. The next few popes spent their time trying to fix the mess. One pope fished Formosus out of the river and reburied him with honors. Then another pope dug him up again to hold another trial, because clearly they hadn't learned their lesson. But eventually, Formosus was allowed to stay in the ground. It's a strange, dusty chapter of history that reminds us that human pettiness truly knows no bounds, not even the boundary of the grave. And while we leave the rotting popes of the 9th century behind, we're going to float over to another royal disaster. Because if you think the papacy was messy, wait until you see what happened when the European monarchies decided that the best way to keep power in the family was to, well, keep it entirely in the family. So we've left the rotting popes of Rome behind, and we're going to drift westward now. Let's head over to the Spanish court in the mid-17th century. It's a place of heavy velvet, suffocating etiquette, and some of the most questionable biological decisions ever made by a ruling class. We're talking about the Habsburgs, specifically the Spanish branch. These were people who viewed a family tree not as a sprawling oak, but more like a very tightly wound, slightly wilted shrub. And at the very center of this shrub was Charles II of Spain. Now, poor Charles is often remembered as El Hechizado, or the Bewitched. It's a bit of a tragic nickname, isn't it? It suggests that his life was some kind of dark fairy tale, which honestly it kind of was, just without the magic or the happy ending. Charles was born in 1661, and from the second he arrived, the Spanish court was less celebratory and more deeply concerned. You see, Charles was the result of generations of what we might politely call keeping it in the family. His father, Philip IV, was also his mother's uncle. If you try to map out his ancestry, you'll find that instead of the usual 32 great 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 grandparents, Charles only had about 10. He was essentially more inbred than if his parents had been siblings. It's a biological miracle he existed at all, really. When he was born, the French ambassador described him with a level of detail that was frankly unnecessary. He mentioned herpes type rashes, a head covered in scabs, and a suppurating duct behind his ear. Not exactly the robust prince the Spanish PR team was hoping for. For the first few years of his life, Charles was treated like a very fragile, very expensive piece of glass. He wasn't even weaned until he was 5 years old, mostly because the doctors were afraid that solid food might actually kill him. He didn't learn to walk until he was almost 6, and even then he needed leg braces. But the thing everyone noticed, the thing you can see in every portrait, even the ones where the painters were clearly trying their best to be kind, was the jaw, the famous Habsburg jaw. In Charles, this wasn't just a prominent chin, it was a structural disaster. His lower jaw protruded so far that his upper and lower teeth couldn't meet. He literally could not chew his food. He just kind of swallowed things whole, which led to a lifetime of chronic indigestion and some truly heroic levels of drooling. His tongue was also notoriously large, so much so that when he did speak, people had a very hard time understanding him. He sounded, as one observer put it, like he was talking through a mouthful of pebbles. Imagine being the king of one of the largest empires on earth, and you can't eat a cracker or tell someone to get you a glass of water without it being a major production. Charles became king when he was only 4, following his father's death. Of course, he didn't actually rule. His mother, Mariana of Austria, who remember was also his aunt, ran things as regent, and she was a piece of work. She was terrified that Charles would die, so she basically kept him in a bubble. He wasn't given much of an education because they didn't want to strain his brain. Instead, he spent his childhood playing with court jesters and counting things. Apparently, he really liked counting things. It was soothing for him. As he got older, the bewitched part of his name really started to take hold. Because nobody understood genetics in the 1600s, they assumed his various ailments, the epilepsy, the hallucinations, the constant sickness, were the result of a curse. Charles himself became convinced of this. He once underwent a full-scale exorcism. They brought in priests to cast out the demons that were supposedly making his jaw so big and his legs so weak. Spoiler alert, the exorcism didn't work. It just made him more depressed. Despite everything, the court decided that Charles needed to get married. They needed an heir because the Habsburg line was looking a bit thin. They found him a French bride, Marie-Louise d'Orléans. She was young, vivacious, and reportedly horrified when she first saw him. Charles, for his part, was actually quite sweet to her. He was shy, gentle, and probably just happy to have someone his own age to talk to. But the marriage was a disaster for one very predictable reason. Charles was almost certainly sterile. They tried everything. His mother even suggested he sleep with the disinterred remains of his father, Philip IV, because apparently in 17th century Spain, corpse proximity was a valid medical treatment for infertility. Charles actually did it. He spent nights lying next to his father's body, hoping some of that royal virility would rub off on him. Again, it didn't work. It just gave him more nightmares. Marie Louise eventually died, possibly of appendicitis, or maybe a broken heart from the sheer boredom of the Spanish court. Charles was devastated. They married him off again to Maria Anna of Neuburg, who was much more aggressive. She spent her time fighting with Charles's mother and trying to manipulate the poor king, who by this point was mostly just trying to find a quiet place to sit down. By the time he was 35, Charles looked like an old man. He was bald, his teeth were mostly gone, and he suffered from constant seizures. He'd spend his days wandering the palace, looking at portraits of his ancestors, probably wondering why they all had the same chin as him. When he finally died in 1700, just before his 39th birthday, the autopsy report was, well, it was legendary. The doctor wrote that his heart was the size of a peppercorn, his lungs were corroded, his intestines were rotten, and he had a single testicle that was black as coal. His head, apparently, was full of water. It was a sad end for a man who never really had a chance. His death triggered the War of the Spanish Succession because he had no heirs, and Europe spent the next 13 years fighting over his stuff. Charles, who just wanted to count things and be left alone, ended up causing the biggest mess in European history just by ceasing to exist. But while Charles was struggling with his jaw and his ghosts, other royal families were having their own issues. Let's float away from the sunny, dusty halls of Madrid and head toward the cold, damp castles of England and Scotland, where the Stuart dynasty was proving that you don't need a massive underbite to be absolutely dysfunctional. So we've moved on from the physical struggles of the Habsburgs, and now we're going to drift toward the 19th century, specifically to the mountains of Bavaria. This is where we find a man who was arguably the most beautiful king in Europe, but also perhaps the loneliest. We're talking about Ludwig II of Bavaria, often called the Mad King, though the Dreaming King probably fits him a bit better. Ludwig was a tall, handsome, brooding teenager when he took the throne in 1864. He looked like he'd stepped straight out of a romantic painting. He had the dark curls, the piercing eyes, and a complete, utter lack of interest in actually governing a country. He became king at 18, which is a stressful age for anyone, but for Ludwig, it was a catastrophe. He hated the noise of Munich. He hated the stuffy politicians with their boring talk of budgets and taxes. He really just wanted to live in a world of Wagnerian opera and medieval knights. Now, Ludwig's family, the Wittelsbachs, were, to put it mildly, a bit eccentric. His aunt believed she had swallowed a glass grand piano. His brother Otto eventually had to be confined because he thought he was becoming a bird. So Ludwig's preference for castles and myths was by comparison actually quite grounded. Ludwig's first big obsession was the composer Richard Wagner. He was basically a 19th century superfan. He spent a fortune paying off Wagner's debts and building him theaters, much to the annoyance of the Bavarian government, who would have preferred he spend that money on, say, an army. But Ludwig didn't care about armies. He cared about the aesthetic of an army. He liked the uniforms, but he didn't want the soldiers to actually do any fighting. It was too messy and loud. As he got older, Ludwig began to withdraw from the world. He started living mostly at night, which is why he was called the Moon King. He would sleep all day, and then in the middle of the night, he'd have his servants dress up in historical costumes. He'd go on moonlight sleigh rides through the snowy Alps, wrapped in heavy furs, sitting in a gold plated sleigh that looked like it belonged in a Disney movie. In fact, if you've ever seen the castle at Disney World, you've seen Ludwig's influence. He spent his entire life in the entire royal treasury building fairy tale castles. Neuschwanstein is the famous one, that towering white stone fortress perched on a cliffside. But here's the thing, it wasn't a fortress for defense, it was a fortress for hiding. Inside Neuschwanstein, Ludwig created a fantasy world. He had a bedroom that took 14 woodcarvers 4 years to finish. He had an artificial cave, a grotto, built inside the palace, complete with a waterfall and a lake where he would be rowed around in a boat shaped like a giant swan. It was essentially a private theme park for a man who couldn't stand the sight of other people. He even had a magic table in his dining room at another palace, Linderhof. The table was on a mechanical lift. The servants would set it in the kitchen below, and then it would rise up through the floor into the dining room. This way, Ludwig could eat a 5-course meal without ever having to make eye contact with a waiter. Honestly, in the age of modern social anxiety, we can kind of relate to that level of commitment to solitude. But while Ludwig was living in his swan boats, the Bavarian government was getting twitchy. He was hemorrhaging money. He was taking out massive loans from foreign banks. He was ignoring his ministers. And perhaps most damagingly, he was losing his looks. The fairy tale king had gained a lot of weight, lost most of his teeth to a sugar addiction, and become increasingly paranoid. In 1886, his ministers finally had enough. They decided to declare him insane. They didn't really have a medical reason, so they just interviewed a few disgruntled servants who said the king talked to trees and liked to have dinner with the ghosts of French kings. Which, to be fair, he did. But was it throw him in jail? Insane? Probably not. A commission of doctors, led by a man named Bernhard von Guden, arrived at Neuschwanstein to take him into custody. Ludwig, in a rare moment of sass, asked the doctor how he could diagnose him with insanity when he'd never actually examined him. The doctor didn't have a great answer. They took Ludwig to Berg Castle and locked him in a room where the door handles had been removed. 2 days later, Ludwig went for a walk by the lake with Dr. von Guden. They never came back. Their bodies were found in the shallow water of Lake Starnberg that night. The official story was that Ludwig drowned himself and the doctor died at trying to save him. But the water was only waist deep. Ludwig was an excellent swimmer. There were no marks on his body, but the doctor had bruises on his head. To this day, people argue about what happened. Was it an escape attempt gone wrong? Was it a murder? Or did the Moon King simply decide that since he couldn't live in his dream, he wouldn't live at all? It's a quiet, tragic mystery that fits his life perfectly. He left behind a legacy of beautiful, empty castles and a mountain of debt. But hey, at least he gave us the inspiration for the most famous theme park on Earth. We've seen kings who were put on trial after death, kings who were shaped by their own DNA, and kings who built castles to hide from the sun. But for our final story tonight, we're going to look at a man who took the concept of avoiding the world to its absolute, most literal extreme. We're traveling to Victorian England, to a massive estate called Welbeck Abbey, to meet William Cavendish Scott Bentinck, the 5th Duke of Portland. Now, if you saw the Duke on the street, though you almost certainly wouldn't, you'd see a man wearing 3 pairs of trousers at once and a hat so large it practically acted as an umbrella. He was the definition of eccentric, but in that very specific, very wealthy British way where people just shrug and say, well, he is a duke after all. The Duke was incredibly shy, not just prefers a quiet corner at a party, shy, but will fire a servant if they accidentally catch his eye, shy. He lived in a state of perpetual social terror. To solve this, he turned his ancestral home, Welbeck Abbey, into a sprawling subterranean fortress of solitude. He hired thousands of workmen, at one point over 15,000 of them, to dig. They dug for years. They built miles of underground tunnels, all wide enough for 2 carriages to pass each other. These tunnels were painted pink and lit by gas lamps, creating a strange, warm, subterranean world where the Duke could move about his estate without ever having to breathe the same air as another human being. His bedroom had a trapdoor in the floor that led directly into this tunnel network. He had an underground ballroom that was so large it could hold 2,000 people, though he never once invited a single guest to see it. He also built an underground library and a giant billiards room. It was a masterpiece of Victorian engineering, all designed to facilitate a life of total isolation. When the Duke had to travel to London, he didn't just hop on a train like a normal person. He would climb into his carriage at Welbeck Abbey, have the curtains drawn tight, and then the carriage would be loaded onto a flatbed rail car. He would sit inside that dark box for the entire journey, never stepping out until he was safely behind the walls of his London mansion. He was like a royal hermit crab, carrying his shell wherever he went. His communication style was just as bizarre. He communicated with his staff almost entirely through letters, which were passed through a double-slotted mailbox in his door. Even his food was delivered via a miniature railway system that ran from the kitchen to his private quarters. If he absolutely had to walk through the house while servants were working, he would shout, "Out of the way," and they would have to hide behind curtains or dive into closets until the Duke had passed. As he grew older, the Duke became obsessed with his health. He became convinced that the smell of paint was poisonous, so he had his rooms repainted over and over again with special, safe mixtures. He lived on a diet of mostly chicken and biscuits, delivered by his silent mechanical train. He died in 1879, a man who had spent millions of pounds just to be left alone. When they finally entered his private rooms after his death, they found them almost entirely empty of furniture, except for a few cupboards and a single bed. He had stripped away everything that wasn't strictly necessary, living a life of monastic simplicity inside a palace of gold and dirt. And so, we reach the end of our journey through the weird, the weary, and the strangely tragic lives of those who held power but couldn't find peace. From the rotting Pope Formosus to the bewitched Charles, the Moon King Ludwig, and finally the Tunnel Duke, history is filled with people who were just as tired and overwhelmed as we sometimes feel. They just happened to have the budgets to build tunnels or castles to deal with it. We're traveling to a tiny speck in the South Atlantic, a place called Tristan da Cunha. It's often cited as the most remote inhabited archipelago in the world, which is basically a polite way of saying it's the ultimate destination for people who find getting away from it all a bit too crowded. But before we land on its rocky shores, let's set the mood. Imagine a place where the nearest neighbor is over 1,500 miles away. There are no flickering neon lights, no sirens, no constant pings from a smartphone, just the steady, rhythmic thrum of the ocean hitting volcanic rock. It's the kind of quiet that feels heavy, like a thick wool blanket. And it's here, on this lonely mountain sticking out of the sea, that a small group of people decided to just stay for centuries. Because why deal with the Industrial Revolution or World Wars when you can just count potatoes and watch the clouds? The story of Tristan da Cunha doesn't start with a grand vision or a holy mission. It starts, as many strange things do, with a man named Jonathan Lambert from Salem, Massachusetts. In 1810, Jonathan looked at the map, saw this uninhabited volcanic island, and decided he was going to be the king of it. He actually declared himself the proprietor and renamed the islands the Islands of Refreshment, which sounds like a very optimistic name for a place that is essentially a windy rock with no trees. He even sent a manifesto to a local newspaper back home, inviting the world to trade with his new kingdom. Unfortunately, the world wasn't really listening, and Jonathan's reign ended rather abruptly when he drowned while out fishing a couple of years later. It turns out, being a king is hard when your entire population is just 3 guys and a very confused goat. But the real history of the island, the sleepy history, begins during the exile of Napoleon Bonaparte. When the British sent Napoleon to St. Helena, they got a little paranoid. They were worried that the French might use Tristan da Cunha as a base to stage a rescue mission. Now, St. Helena is about 1,200 miles away from Tristan. To launch a rescue from there in a wooden sailing ship would be like trying to stage a prison break from a different time zone using a rowboat. But because the British military loves a good redundant project, they sent a garrison of Marines to occupy the island in 1816. They built a small fort, realized very quickly that the only thing invading the island was the wind, and eventually the government decided to pack it all up and head home. But one man, a Scottish corporal named William Glass, looked at the jagged cliffs and the endless rain and thought, yeah, this is the spot for me. He asked permission to stay behind with his wife and 2 children. 2 other sailors decided to join them, probably because they preferred the quiet of the volcano to the discipline of the Royal Navy. This was the core of the community. They created a written constitution that was incredibly simple. Everything was shared. No one was better than anyone else. It was a tiny, accidental utopia fueled by sheep and isolation. And for a long time, the rest of the world just blinked and moved on. The 19th century roared past. Steamships replaced sails. Empires rose and fell. But on Tristan, The main concern was whether the albatrosses were nesting or if the potato crop was going to be particularly sandy this year. As the years drifted by, the population grew in the most random way possible. Shipwrecks were the island's version of a recruitment agency. A ship would hit the rocks, the survivors would scramble ashore, look around, and realize that going back to civilization sounded like a lot of work, so they stayed. An Italian sailor here, a Dutch wanderer there. They all married into the few existing families: Glass, Swain, Rogers, Green, Hagen, Repetto, and Lavarello. If your last name isn't one of those seven, you're officially a tourist. Now, because the population was so small and the location was so remote, the genetics started to get cozy. Much like our friends the Habsburgs, but without the fancy crowns or the giant chins. On Tristan, this manifests in a very specific way: asthma. Almost everyone on the island has it. It's a genetic quirk passed down through the generations, a tiny price to pay for living in a place where the only traffic jam is caused by a wandering cow. Life on the island became a slow, repetitive loop. They developed a unique dialect, a soft, musical blend of 19th century English, American whaling slang, and bits of Italian and Afrikaans. It sounds like a language that has been preserved in amber, vibrating at a lower frequency than the rest of the world. They don't have a currency in the traditional sense for a long time. They traded in labor and goods. You help me fix my roof, I give you a sack of potatoes. It's the ultimate low-stress economy. But even the most forgotten places have their moments of drama. In 1961, the volcano that everyone had assumed was extinct decided to clear its throat. A giant fissure opened up right near the settlement, spitting out lava and smoke. The British government, finally remembering that these people existed, swooped in and evacuated the entire population, about 260 people, to England. Imagine being a Tristanian in 1961. You've spent your whole life on a quiet rock in the middle of the ocean, and suddenly you're in the middle of London during the swinging 60s. You're seeing cars for the first time. You're seeing television. You're seeing millions of people rushing around like ants. For most people, this would be an upgrade. But for the Tristanians, it was a nightmare. They hated the noise. They hated the flu germs. They especially hated the fact that in England, you had to pay for things like water and land. The British government tried to convince them to stay. They told them the island was dangerous. They told them England was the land of opportunity. But as soon as the volcano cooled down, the Tristanians held a vote. Almost every single one of them voted to go back. They preferred the risk of a volcanic eruption to the certainty of a 9-to-5 job in a cold, gray city. They returned to their island, rebuilt their houses, and went right back to their sheep and their potatoes. They even have a post office now, which is the island's main source of income. Collectors all over the world pay huge amounts for stamps from the most remote island on Earth. It's a bit ironic, isn't it? The world pays them to stay away. Today, Tristan da Cunha remains a bubble in time. There's still no airport. If you want to go there, you have to catch a fishing boat from Cape Town, a journey that takes 6 days across some of the roughest seas on the planet. And once you arrive, there are no hotels. You stay with a family. You eat what they eat. You move at their pace. It's a place where hurrying is considered a personality flaw. As we linger here on the shores of Tristan, watching the fog roll in over the peaks, we realize that maybe they have the right idea. While we're all worrying about the latest news cycle or the stock market, they're just waiting for the next ship to bring the mail once every few months. It's a slow, quiet existence, a long, deep breath in the middle of a frantic world. But Tristan isn't the only place where time seems to have folded in on itself. Let's float away from the South Atlantic now, drifting northward through the warm currents of the tropics toward the dense, emerald jungles of Southeast Asia. We're looking for a different kind of forgotten story, one not of an island, but of a city that was swallowed by the earth itself. So, we've left the windswept rocks of Tristan da Cunha and we're drifting across the Indian Ocean. The air is getting thicker now, warmer and heavy with the scent of damp earth and blooming jasmine. We're moving toward the heart of Cambodia, specifically to a place called Angkor. Now, when we think of lost cities, we usually imagine something from a movie, golden idols and booby traps. But the reality of Angkor is much more peaceful, and in a way, much more haunting. Imagine a city that, at its peak in the 12th century, was the largest urban center in the world. It was a sprawling metropolis of 1 million people, full of grand stone temples, intricate canals, and bustling markets. And then slowly, the people just stopped being there. The story of Angkor is really the story of the Khmer Empire and their obsession with water. They were the absolute masters of engineering. They didn't just build temples, they reshaped the entire landscape. They built massive reservoirs called barrays that were so large you can see them from space. These weren't just for drinking, they were a status symbol. It was their way of saying, "We have conquered the monsoon." But there's a certain irony in trying to control nature on that scale. Eventually, nature usually finds a way to win. Let's talk about Jayavarman VII. He was arguably the greatest of the Khmer kings, but also perhaps the most extra. After a period of war, he decided to rebuild the capital in a way that would make everyone else's palaces look like garden sheds. He built the Bayon, that famous temple with hundreds of giant stone faces carved into the towers. No matter where you stand in the temple, those faces are looking at you with a slight, knowing smile. It's the 12th century version of Big Brother is watching, but with a lot more zen and a lot less paperwork. Jayavarman was a man in a hurry. He built hospitals, rest houses, and roads. But all that construction required an enormous amount of wood. They stripped the surrounding forests to fuel the lime kilns and provide timber for the homes of 1 million people. And when you remove the trees in a tropical climate, the soil starts to move. Slowly, the very canals that made Angkor powerful started to fail. During the dry season, they filled with silt. During the monsoon, they overflowed and washed away the foundations of the city. It wasn't a sudden disaster, no volcanic eruption or great fire. It was just a slow, grinding decline. The infrastructure started to break, and the people, tired of fixing the same canals for the 100th year in a row, began to drift away toward the coast. By the 15th century, the great stone temples were mostly silent. The king moved the capital to Phnom Penh, and the jungle moved into Angkor. This is the part of the story that feels like a dream. For hundreds of years, these massive stone structures sat in total silence. the silk cotton trees began to grow over the walls. Their roots, thick and pale like giant snakes, wrapped around the carvings of gods and dancers, slowly pulling the stones apart. Moss covered the smiling faces of the Bayan. The local villagers always knew the temples were there, of course. They lived in their shadows, grazing their cattle among the ruins. But to the outside world, Angkor was a myth. It was a ghost city, whispered about by travelers, but never seen. Then, in the mid 1800s, a French naturalist named Henri Mouhos stumbled upon it. He wasn't looking for a city, he was looking for butterflies. Imagine hacking through the dense, humid jungle, sweating through your clothes, swatting away mosquitoes, and suddenly coming face to face with Angkor Wat, a stone mountain rising out of the green, perfectly reflected in a still moat. Mohot's journals captured that feeling of sleepy awe. He wrote that it was grander than anything left to us by Greece or Rome. But he also fell into that classic European trap of thinking the locals couldn't have built it. He thought it must have been built by some lost tribe, or perhaps ancient giants. He couldn't wrap his head around the idea that a civilization could be that brilliant and then simply decide to leave. But they didn't really leave. They just changed. The Khmer people are still there, but the city itself became a monument to the fact that nothing, not even a city of 1 million people, is permanent. Today, if you visit Angkor at dawn, before the crowds arrive, you can still feel that heavy, ancient silence. You can hear the gibbons calling from the tops of the trees that are currently eating the temples. It's a place where the line between man-made and nature-made has completely blurred. The stones are becoming trees, and the trees are becoming stones. It's the ultimate bedtime story for a civilization. A reminder that even the most powerful empires eventually get tired, tuck themselves in, and let the moss grow over the windows. But while Angkor was being swallowed by the jungle, elsewhere in the world, other elites were busy trying to keep their dynasties alive through increasingly creative means. Let's float away from the damp heat of Cambodia and head toward the cold, gilded halls of Northern Europe. We're going to look at the sad, sickly, and spoiled world of the royal nurseries, where being a prince or princess wasn't all it was cracked up to be. In fact, it was often a recipe for a very short, very strange life. So we've left the vines of Cambodia behind, and we're drifting across the map, watching the colors fade from emerald green to the dusty, muted tones of old parchment and cold stone. We're arriving in the castles of medieval and Renaissance Europe, places like the Louvre in Paris or the Tower of London. But we aren't going to the throne rooms or the banquet halls. Instead, we're going to the nursery. You see, being born a royal child was a bit like winning a lottery, where the prize was a golden cage and a very high probability of never making it to your 10th birthday. Today, we think of spoiled children as having too many toys. But back then, a spoiled royal child was one who was essentially a political chess piece from the moment they let out their first cry. Imagine being 3 years old and already being technically engaged to a 30-year-old duke from a country you can't pronounce. That was the life of the royal elite. The atmosphere in these nurseries was a strange mix of extreme luxury and what we would now consider absolute medical horror. These children were surrounded by the finest silks and given gold-plated rattles, but they were also being cared for by doctors who believed that the best cure for a common cold was to rub the child's feet with roasted onions, or, if they were feeling particularly fancy, powdered unicorn horn, which, as it turns out, was usually just ground up narwhal tusk. Let's talk about the sheer dynastic weirdness of it all, because these families were so obsessed with keeping their land and their titles, they ended up marrying their cousins so often that the family trees started to look like telephone poles. This led to what historians call the delicate constitution of royal children. They were often pale, frail, and prone to the vapors, which was a Victorian way of saying they were constantly overwhelmed by the sheer stress of existing. Take, for example, the children of King James I of England. James was a man who famously hated the sight of a drawn sword and wore padded clothes because he was terrified of being stabbed. He brought that same level of anxious energy to his parenting. His children were raised in a world of constant surveillance. They weren't allowed to just play. Everything was a lesson. Everything was a performance. One of his sons, Prince Charles, the one who would eventually lose his head in the English Civil War, was a remarkably sickly child. He had rickets, which meant his legs were weak and bowed. He didn't even learn to walk until he was 7 years old. Imagine the future King of England having to be carried everywhere by servants because his bones were literally too soft to support him. But it wasn't just the physical ailments, it was the emotional weight. These children were often separated from their parents almost immediately. They were raised by a household, a small army of wet nurses, tutors, and governesses whose entire job was to make sure the child didn't accidentally die before a profitable marriage could be arranged. There was a practice called the whipping boy. Because the prince was considered divinely chosen by God, his tutors weren't allowed to hit him when he misbehaved. But someone had to be punished, right? So the palace would find a poor boy of similar age to grow up alongside the prince. Every time the prince failed his Latin exam or threw a tantrum, the whipping boy was the one who got the lashing. It was a brilliantly messed up system. The idea was that the prince would feel so guilty watching his friend suffer for his mistakes that he would eventually behave. In reality, it mostly just created a generation of royal adults who were either deeply traumatized or incredibly talented at ignoring other people's pain. And then there were the little queens. Some of these girls were shipped off to foreign countries at the age of 6 or 7 to live in a court where they didn't speak the language, surrounded by strangers who were all watching them for the first sign of a biological heir. Isabella of Valois was only 6 years old when she was married to Richard II of England. She reportedly took her role very seriously, trying to act like a grand queen while still wanting to play with her dolls. It's a tragic, ironic image. A child in a heavy, jewel-encrusted gown trying to navigate the cutthroat world of 14th century politics, while her main concern should have been losing her baby teeth. The diet in these nurseries wasn't much better. Because they were special, they weren't given the simple, healthy porridge that a peasant child might eat. No, they were fed the best food, which meant a lot of sugar, heavy meats, and wine diluted with water. By the time they were teenagers, many of them had teeth that looked like charred stumps. But through all the sickness, The inbreeding and the bizarre tutors, these children were still the focus of the entire world. Their every sneeze was recorded by ambassadors and sent back to foreign kings like it was breaking news. The Dauphin has a runny nose. The Spanish crown should prepare for a diplomatic shift. It was a life of quiet, gilded misery, a world where you were a god in the eyes of the law, but you couldn't even pick out your own socks without a committee meeting. As we leave the damp, drafty hallways of the medieval nurseries, we're going to float toward one final destination. We've seen forgotten islands, vanished cities, and spoiled princes. But for our final stop, we're going to look at the most sleepy royal of them all, a man who lived his entire life in a literal and metaphorical fog, a king who became a ghost while he was still wearing the crown. We've drifted through the South Atlantic, through the humid jungles of Cambodia, and through the stifling nurseries of the European elite. For our final stop, we're arriving at the end of the line, the quiet, velvet-lined finale of a dynasty. We're going to look at the last days of the Russian Romanovs, but not the parts you usually hear about. We aren't here for the revolution or the noise. We're here for the quiet, melancholy fog that settled over the family long before the end. We're looking at Tsar Nicholas II and his son, the Tsarevich Alexei. Now, Nicholas was a man who never really wanted the big job. He was a gentle, somewhat shy man who preferred taking long walks, playing tennis, and meticulously recording the weather in his diary. If he had been born a country squire, he would have been the happiest man in Russia. But he was born a czar, and the weight of that crown was like a lead weight on a man made of glass. When his son Alexei was born in 1904, the entire empire breathed a sigh of relief. Finally, a male heir. But the relief lasted about 6 weeks. That's when they discovered the royal secret, the same one that had been creeping through the veins of the British, Spanish, and German royals. Alexei had hemophilia. In the early 20th century, this was a death sentence that arrived in slow motion. Because the boy's blood wouldn't clot, a simple bruise on the knee wasn't just a boo-boo. It was an internal hemorrhage that could last for weeks, causing excruciating pain and leaving the child bedridden in a darkened room. The atmosphere in the Alexander Palace became one of a permanent hushed funeral. To protect the boy, the family withdrew from the world. They created a sleepy fortress. Nicholas and his wife, Alexandra, became obsessed with keeping Alexei safe. They hired 2 massive sailors to follow the boy every second of the day, their only job being to catch him if he stumbled. Imagine being a child and never being allowed to run, never being allowed to jump, never being allowed to just be a kid. Because they had to keep the illness a secret to maintain the image of a strong monarchy, the Romanovs became ghosts in their own country. The grand balls stopped. The glittering parades became rare. The Tsar spent more and more time tucked away in his study, while Alexandra sought comfort in the mystical and the strange, which is how a certain bearded, holy man named Rasputin ended up in the palace. But let's look at the irony here. While the world outside was screaming for change, while the Industrial Revolution was churning and the Great War was looming, the center of the Russian Empire was a quiet room where a mother sat by her son's bed, listening to him breathe. The great power of Russia was paralyzed by a single microscopic defect in a child's DNA. Nicholas, for his part, handled the stress by leaning into his own sleepy nature. His diaries from the time are almost comically mundane. While the empire was crumbling, he would write, "Walked in the park, shot 2 crows, drank tea, the weather was lovely." It wasn't that he didn't care, it was that he had completely checked out. He had retreated into a private world of family and routine, a world where time had essentially stopped. When the end finally came and the family was sent into exile in Siberia, the strangest thing happened. They actually seemed relieved, away from the pressure of the throne, away from the angry crowds and the boring ministers. They lived a simple, quiet life. They chopped wood. They read books aloud to each other. They grew vegetables. In those final months, they were finally the ordinary family they had always wanted to be. They had reached their own Tristan da Cunha, their own Angkor, a place where the noise of history couldn't reach them anymore. And so, we come to the end of our long, winding journey. We've seen that whether it's a volcanic island in the Atlantic, a city swallowed by the Cambodian jungle, a child trapped in a golden nursery, or a czar who just wanted to walk in the woods, history isn't always about the loud moments. Sometimes it's about the quiet ones. It's about the desire to pull the covers up, turn off the lights, and let the rest of the world fade away. The story of humanity isn't just a record of wars and progress. It's a record of people looking for a place to rest. And as we finish our monologue tonight, I hope you've found yours. The candles have burned down to the wick. The ink on the parchment is dry. The great stone faces of the temples are sleeping under their blankets of moss, and the waves are still hitting the rocks of the forgotten island, just as they have for 1,000 years. We're going to wander through the lives of people who had everything: crowns, palaces, entire nations, and somehow managed to lose it all through sheer, baffling incompetence. We're starting with a story that feels like it shouldn't be true, but in the chaotic world of the 14th century, it was just another Tuesday. We're talking about King Christian II of Denmark, or more specifically, the general vibe of the medieval Scandinavian monarchs who treated their kingdoms like a high stakes poker game where they didn't actually know the rules. But before we get to the actual dice, we have to understand the kind of person who ends up in this situation. It's usually someone who was born into so much power that they never developed a sense of consequences. You know the type, the kind of person who thinks that if they run out of money, they can just print more, or in this case, just bet a province on a roll of the bone. Let's look at the setting. Northern Europe in the late Middle Ages was a mess of unions, betrayals, and royal families that were so intertwined they were practically a single, very stressed out entity. We're talking about the Kalmar Union, a period where Denmark, Norway, and Sweden were all supposed to be friends under one crown. Spoiler alert, they were not friends. It was like a 150-year-long Thanksgiving dinner where everyone is smiling but also clutching a steak knife under the table. Our main character for this specific brand of disaster is often cited as King Christian II, but really, he was just the tip of an iceberg made of poor life choices. Christian was a man of, let's call them bold impulses. He had this habit of thinking he was much smarter than everyone else in the room, which is a dangerous trait when the other people in the room are Swedish nobles who really, really hate you. Christian is famous for the Stockholm bloodbath, which, aside from having a very metal name, was a complete PR nightmare. He invited all the Swedish elite to a reconciliation party after he'd conquered the city. He promised them a clean slate and a good time. There was music, there was wine, and then on the third day, he simply locked the doors and started executing everyone. Because why bother with diplomacy when you can just eliminate the entire guest list? It was a classic double down move. He thought it would make the Swedes submissive. Instead, it made them so angry that they spent the next few centuries making sure Denmark never had a nice day again. But let's pivot back to the gambling, because that's where the sleepy incompetence really shines. In the medieval courts, when the sun went down and the heavy tapestries were pulled shut against the Baltic wind, there wasn't much to do. No Netflix, no scrolling, just firelight, heavy ale, and dice. These dice were usually made of bone, often sheep or pig, and they were the ruin of many a royal treasury. There's a legendary tale, part history, part cautionary anecdote, about a king who found himself in a particularly heated game with a rival noble. Now, when you're a king, you don't bet gold coins. That's for merchants. You bet things like the tax rights to this specific harbor or the fishing rights to that entire coastline. It starts small. You lose a village, then you lose a castle. Then, because your ego is currently driving the bus, you decide to bet an entire island. Imagine the conversation the next morning. The king wakes up with a headache. The sun is shining through the window, and his chamberlain walks in looking like he's just seen a ghost. Your Majesty, about last night, we're going to need to update the maps. Why? Well, you rolled a 4, and the Duke rolled a 6, so technically, Bornholm belongs to him now. Also, his cousin owns your favorite hunting dogs. This wasn't just a one-off event. The history of the Danish and Swedish crowns is littered with these moments of impulse control issues. They would pawn off entire provinces to German bankers or Holstein counts just to fund a war that they'd probably lose anyway. It was a cycle of borrow, gamble, lose, repeat. Christian II eventually found himself in a position where no one wanted him. He was kicked out of Denmark, kicked out of Sweden, and ended up wandering around Europe trying to find someone to lend him an army. He even visited his brother-in-law, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who was the most powerful man in the world. Charles looked at Christian, this guy who had lost 3 kingdoms and managed to offend every noble in Scandinavia, and basically told him to go sit in a corner. Christian spent the last 27 years of his life as a prisoner. But he wasn't in a dungeon. He was in a castle, Sonderborg Castle, where he was allowed to walk around, eat decent food, and presumably think about all the rolls of the dice that had gone the wrong way. There's a famous story that he spent his years walking around a circular table in his room, wearing a groove into the floor with his thumb as he traced the edge, over and over again. It's the ultimate monotone ending to a life of high-stakes drama. Just a man, a table, and a circular path to nowhere. But while Christian was wearing a hole in the floor of his prison, other monarchs were busy making even weirder choices. Let's float away from the cold, gray waters of the Baltic and head south toward the sun-drenched but equally dysfunctional courts of the Mediterranean. We're looking for a different kind of royal mess, one involving a king who was so obsessed with a very specific, very strange hobby that he almost forgot he had a country to run. We're moving toward the story of a man who was supposed to be a warrior, but really just wanted to be a librarian with a very expensive collection of heretical books. We've left the cold, circular path of Christian II behind, and we're drifting southward. The air is thinning as we cross the Alps, turning from that damp, salty Baltic chill into the dry, sun-baked heat of the Spanish plateau. We're arriving at the Escorial, a building that is part palace, part monastery, and part mausoleum. This was the headquarters of Philip II of Spain, a man who ruled over an empire where the sun never set, yet he spent almost all of his time in a small, dark room surrounded by piles of paper. Philip II is a fascinating study in productive dysfunction. He was called the Prudent, but a better name might have been the Micromanager. He was a man who believed that if he just read enough reports, he could control the entire world. He sat at a desk in the middle of nowhere, obsessively checking the margins of documents. He once famously corrected a subordinate's spelling of a word in a report about an impending invasion. Because, of course, the grammar of the letter was just as important as the actual fleet of ships. But the thing about Philip that really keeps the sleepy vibe going was his relationship with time and space. He hated the traveling. He hated the noise of the court. He wanted everything to be silent and orderly. He built the Escorial in the shape of a grill, supposedly to honor St. Lawrence, who was roasted alive, which is a very specific architectural choice. It was a massive gray stone square, and inside Philip lived like a monk. While his soldiers were conquering the New World, and his gold was inflating the entire European economy, Philip was busy with his true passion, his library. He had one of the largest collections of books in the world, including thousands of texts on alchemy, magic, and the occult. He was convinced that somewhere in those dusty pages was the secret to ultimate knowledge, or perhaps just a better way to balance the royal checkbook. Imagine the king of the most powerful nation on earth sitting by candlelight, squinting at a 500-year-old manuscript about how to turn lead into gold, while his actual gold was sitting in ships being chased by English pirates. It's a beautiful, ironic contrast. He was looking for a miracle in a book while ignoring the reality of his own crumbling finances. But Philip wasn't the only one in his family with a special relationship to reality. Let's float over to his descendant, Rudolph II, the Holy Roman Emperor. If Philip was a micromanager, Rudolph was a non-manager. He moved the entire imperial court to Prague because he liked the vibe there better, and then he basically went into hiding. Rudolph was the ultimate gilded hermit. He was plagued by melancholy, what we would now call severe depression and social anxiety. He was terrified of being assassinated, but he was even more terrified of having to talk to people. To avoid his ministers, he built a Kunstkammer, or a cabinet of curiosities. It was a massive collection of weird stuff, supposed unicorn horns, clockwork automatons, preserved mermaids, which were just monkey torsos sewn onto fishtails, and a magic mirror. If a diplomat wanted to talk to Rudolph about an impending war in the Balkans, they usually had to wait for months. Rudolph would be in his private rooms, staring at a piece of true dragon bone, or hanging out with his court astronomers, Tycho Brahe and Johannes Kepler. Brahe was a man who had a prosthetic nose, made of gold and silver, because he lost his real one in a duel over a math equation. This was the kind of company Rudolph kept. Rudolph's reign was like a long, slow fever dream. He didn't want to marry, he didn't want to fight, and he certainly didn't want to sign anything. He just wanted to live in his castle with his lions. He actually kept pet lions that roamed the palace halls, which made delivery of the morning mail a very high stakes job. Eventually, his family had to intervene. His brother, Matthias, realized that having an emperor who preferred talking to alchemists over generals was a bit of a liability. They staged a family intervention, which in the 1600s meant a quiet coup. Rudolph was allowed to stay in his palace in Prague, but he was stripped of his power. He spent his final days looking out the window at the city he had ignored, surrounded by his magic objects that had failed to protect him from his own family. It's a recurring theme in these royal lives, the desire to retreat, to find a room, a library, or a cabinet of curiosities where the world can't reach you. They had the power to do anything, and what they chose to do was hide. But as we leave the dusty libraries of Prague and Madrid, we're going to drift back toward the sea. We're going to look at a king who didn't hide in a library, but instead tried to turn his entire life into a theater performance. A man who was so obsessed with his own image that he almost forgot he was a human being. We're moving toward the sun-drenched, suffocatingly formal halls of Versailles. Part 3. The Golden Cage and the Ritual of the Shirt. We've left the lions of Prague behind, and we're floating over the French countryside toward a place that was essentially a high-end prison disguised as a jewel box. We're arriving at Versailles. This was the masterpiece of Louis XIV, the Sun King. Now Louis was the opposite of our hermit kings. He didn't want to hide. He wanted to be the only thing anyone ever looked at. But in doing so, he turned his entire life into a monotone, repetitive ritual that would make a modern office job look like a thrilling adventure. Imagine a world where you can't even put on your own socks without 20 of the highest-ranking nobles in the country watching you do it. This was the levee, or the royal rising. Every morning around 8:30, the head valet would wake Louis up. But he wasn't just waking up a man, he was waking up the state. The doors would open, and in would march the first group of people. These were the ones with the grand entry privileges. They would watch the king get out of bed. Then the next group would come in to watch him wash his hands with a piece of cotton soaked in wine, because water was considered a bit too adventurous for the royal skin. Then came the main event, the putting on of the shirt. There was a strict hierarchy for who got to touch the shirt. If a prince of the blood was in the room, he was the only one allowed to hand the right sleeve to the king. If you were just a duke, you might get to hold the candlestick, but don't even think about touching the linen. Louis sat there day after day, year after year, letting grown men argue over who got to help him into his breeches. It was a golden cage where the bars were made of etiquette and the lock was his own ego. Louis's entire goal was to keep the nobility so busy with these tiny, meaningless rituals that they didn't have the time or energy to start a civil war. He turned the warriors of France into fashion consultants. He made them move to Versailles, where they had to spend astronomical amounts of money on lace, wigs, and silk just to stay in his favor. They lived in tiny, cramped apartments that smelled of sewage and expensive perfume, all for the chance to watch the king eat his soup. And the eating was its own kind of marathon. Louis had a legendary appetite. His sister in law once wrote that she had seen him eat 4 plates of different soups, a whole pheasant, a partridge, a large plate of salad, 2 slices of ham, mutton with garlic, and a plate of pastry, all in one sitting. He ate in front of a crowd, of course. People would stand behind a railing just to watch him chew. It was the 17th century version of a mukbang, but with more violins and less talking. But there was a darker, more tragic side to this sun drenched spectacle. Because Louis wanted to be the sun, he had to endure things that would have broken a normal person. He suffered from chronic health issues that were made infinitely worse by his doctors. At one point, they decided that all his ailments were coming from his teeth. Their solution? To pull out every single tooth in his upper jaw. They did this without anesthesia, and in the process, they accidentally broke part of his jawbone and ripped a hole in the roof of his mouth. For the rest of his life, whenever the Sun King drank wine, it would occasionally come out of his nose. Imagine trying to maintain the dignity of the most powerful man in Europe while your drink is taking a detour through your sinuses. But because he was Louis, he just wiped his face and continued with the ritual. The show had to go on. The irony of Louis's life was that by making himself the center of everything, he became a slave to the schedule. He once said, with an almanac and a watch, one could tell from 300 leagues away what the king was doing. His life was a series of timed performances, the 10 a.m. Mass, the 11 a.m. Council, the 1 p.m. dinner. He was a man who had built a palace to his own glory, only to find himself trapped in the gears of the clock he had set in motion. As he grew older, the sun began to set in a very lonely way. Most of his children and grandchildren died before him, many of them from smallpox or measles. The palace that had been full of music and dancing became a quiet, drafty place of mourning. He spent his final days being wheeled through the gardens he had designed, looking at the fountains that were only turned on when he passed by to save water. As we leave the silent, mirrored halls of Versailles, we're going to drift back across the English Channel. We're going to look at one final royal disaster, a man who didn't want to be a son or a hermit, but who found that his own mind was a kingdom he couldn't control. We're moving toward the story of the king who talked to trees. So we leave the scent of heavy French perfume and the sound of clicking heels on marble behind. We're drifting across the gray, choppy waters of the Channel, landing softly on the damp lawns of Kew Gardens in England. We're arriving in the early 19th century, a time of steam engines and revolution, but for our final character, the world had shrunk down to the size of a single room and a very confused mind. We're talking about George III. Now, George is often remembered in history books as the king who lost America, or the Mad King. But if we look at him through our sleepy lens, he wasn't a villain or a lunatic. He was a man who was simply exhausted by the burden of being a king. George was actually a very normal guy at heart. He loved farming, they called him Farmer George. He liked plain food, he was loyal to his wife, and he was genuinely interested in science and clocks. He was, in many ways, the most relatable monarch we've talked about tonight. But George's tragedy was biological. He likely suffered from porphyria, a genetic blood disorder that can cause severe physical pain and eventually mental collapse. For George, this manifested as a logorrhea, a fancy word for talking until you literally run out of air. During his fits, he would talk for 24 hours straight, jumping from topic to topic, his voice growing hoarse but his brain refusing to stop. Imagine the quiet, dignified halls of Windsor Castle being filled with the sound of a king who won't stop talking about the price of hay, the mechanics of a clock, and the genealogy of the German nobility, all in one breath. It's the ultimate sleepy disaster, a man trapped in a monologue he can't end. There's a famous heartbreaking story from one of his episodes where the king was walking in the gardens and approached an oak tree. He reportedly tipped his hat to the tree, shook one of its branches, and began a long, formal conversation, believing he was speaking to the King of Prussia. He wasn't being aggressive, he was being polite. He was just in a different version of reality. To cure him, the doctors of the time used methods that were essentially a form of state sanctioned torture. They used blistering, which involved applying caustic chemicals to his skin to draw out the evil humors, and they kept him in a straitjacket for weeks at a time. They even forced him to sit in a coercion chair to keep him still. Imagine being the king of the British Empire, the man who had defeated Napoleon, being tied to a chair because you wouldn't stop talking to the scenery. In his final years, George became a ghost. He was blind, he was deaf, and he lived in a permanent twilight. He grew a long, white beard that reached his chest and spent his days wandering through his private rooms in a purple dressing gown. He would play the harpsichord, music he remembered from his youth, and talk to people who had been dead for decades. He was living in a palace of memories, a place where the American Revolution had never happened and his children were still small. He died in 1820, having lived a life of 81 years, but having left the world long before that. His story is a reminder that the crown doesn't protect you from the frailties of being human. If anything, it just makes the decline more public and more painful. And so, we reach the end of our long, slow walk through the gallery of royal disasters. We've seen the king who lost his provinces on a roll of the dice, the emperor who preferred magic mirrors to politics, the Sun King who turned his life into a clockwork performance, and the farmer king who lost himself in a conversation with a tree. They all had the world at their feet, but in the end, they were all just looking for the same thing we are: a bit of quiet, a bit of peace, and a place where the noise of the world finally stops. The fire in the hearth has burned down to a dull orange glow. The tapestries are still, and the shadows have lengthened to cover the floor. The dice are back in their box. The books are closed on the shelf, and the gardens are silent under the moonlight. We're heading to London in the mid-19th century. Now, usually, when we think of Victorian London, we think of top hats, foggy cobblestone streets, and maybe a polite afternoon tea. But tonight, we're focusing on a different sensation. Not the sights, not the sounds, but the smell. We're talking about the summer of 1858, famously known as the Great Stink. It was the year the British Empire, at the height of its global power, was brought to its knees by its own plumbing, or rather, the complete lack of it. It's a story about how humans can be incredibly smart at building steam engines and conquering continents, but remarkably slow at figuring out where to put, well, their own waste. To understand the Great Stink, we have to talk about the River Thames. For centuries, the Thames was London's everything. It was the source of water, the highway for trade, and unfortunately, the city's primary dumpster. By the 1850s, London had grown into the largest city in the world. It was bursting at the seams with 3 million people, and all 3 million of them were contributing to a very specific, very biological problem. Now, the Victorians were actually quite proud of themselves because they had just started installing these newfangled things called flush toilets. They thought they were being very modern and hygienic, but there was a slight design flaw. These toilets didn't lead to a treatment plant. They led to old, crumbling cesspools or directly into the street gutters. And where did the gutters lead? Right into the Thames. So by 1858, the river wasn't really a river anymore. It was more of a slow-moving, opaque, chocolate-colored sludge. It was so thick that people joked you could practically walk across it, though you definitely wouldn't want to. Then came the heat. The summer of 1858 was unusually, almost suspiciously, hot. The sun beat down on the mudflats of the Thames, and the river began to ferment. It wasn't just a bad smell, it was a physical force. People blocks away were fainting. The curtains of the Houses of Parliament, which sat right on the riverbank, were soaked in chloride of lime to try and neutralize the odor. It didn't work. The politicians, the men who ruled half the world, were forced to hold their handkerchiefs over their faces just to get through a meeting. It's a wonderful bit of irony, isn't it? These powerful men were debating grand imperial strategies, while their own noses were telling them that they had fundamentally failed at basic city management. They tried to ignore it for a while, because that's what politicians do. They formed committees, they wrote reports, they blamed the weather. But eventually, the smell became so aggressive that they considered moving the entire government out of London to Oxford or St. Albans. There's a great snarky aside in the newspapers of the time, where journalists pointed out that it took the smell reaching the noses of the wealthy and powerful for anything to actually happen. As long as it was just the poor people in the slums getting cholera and smelling the filth, it was an unfortunate necessity of urban life. But once the Chancellor of the Exchequer couldn't eat his lunch without gagging, it became a national emergency. The solution came from a man named Joseph Bazalgette. He was an engineer with a very impressive mustache and an even more impressive plan. He wanted to build a massive system of intercepting sewers that would carry the waste away from the river and out to the sea. It was an enormous, expensive, and frankly boring project. And because it was boring, the government had been stalling on it for years. But the Great Stink broke the deadlock. In a rare moment of bureaucratic speed, Parliament passed a bill in 18 days to fund Bazalgette's sewers. They realized that they couldn't rule an empire if they were constantly throwing up in their top hats. Bazalgette's work was incredible. He used 318 million bricks and moved enough earth to change the geography of the city. He built the embankments, those beautiful stone walkways along the Thames, not for the view, but to hide the massive pipes underneath. He even had the foresight to make the pipes much larger than necessary, which is why London's sewer system still works today. He predicted that the population would grow, and he didn't want his descendants to have to deal with another great stink. But while Bazalgette was under the streets saving London from its own stomach, other elites were dealing with different kinds of fragile situations. Let's float away from the muddy banks of the Thames and head toward the royal palaces of Europe. Because if you think a stinky river is a disaster, wait until you see what happens when the most powerful families in the world decide that the best way to keep their purity is to never marry anyone outside their own living room. We're moving toward the world of the glass royals, people who were so sheltered, so inbred, and so detached from reality that they were practically a different species. We're heading to the court of Bavaria, where we find a king who was much more interested in swan shaped boats than he was in his own kingdom's survival. We've left the humid, heavy air of London behind. The smell of the Thames has dissipated, and the air is turning crisp and cool. We're drifting over the jagged snow capped peaks of the Bavarian Alps. Down below, nestled in the dark green velvet of the pine forests, we see a white castle that looks like it was plucked directly out of a dream. This is Neuschwanstein, and the man who built it was perhaps the most sleepy monarch in all of history, Ludwig II of Bavaria. Now, Ludwig is often called the Mad King, but that's a bit of a harsh label for a guy who mostly just wanted to be left alone to listen to opera. He became king in 1864 when he was only 18 years old. He was tall, strikingly handsome, and he had these deep, soulful eyes that made all the debutantes of Europe swoon. He was called the fairy tale king, but he quickly realized that being a king in the 19th century wasn't actually a fairy tale. It was mostly just signing boring papers and pretending to care about the Prussian military. Ludwig's response to the stress of reality was simple. He opted out. He decided that if the world wasn't a fairy tale, he would simply build one. He became obsessed with the composer Richard Wagner. Ludwig wasn't just a fan, he was a 19th century stan. He spent a vast portion of the royal treasury paying off Wagner's debts and building him a private opera house. The Bavarian government was naturally horrified. They wanted him to spend money on cannons and railroads, but Ludwig was much more interested in the set design for the Flying Dutchman. As the years went by, Ludwig withdrew further and further into his own mind. He stopped appearing in public. He stopped living in Munich. He became a creature of the night, which earned him the nickname the Moon King. He would sleep all day in darkened rooms and wake up as the sun went down. Imagine being a servant at one of his mountain lodges. You'd be expected to dress up in 18th century French court costumes, even though you were in the middle of a German forest in 1880. You'd have to serve the king a 5-course dinner at 3 in the morning. And the kicker? Ludwig would often demand that you set places for ghost guests. He would have long, polite conversations with the invisible spirits of Louis XIV of France or Marie Antoinette. Because honestly, if you're a king, why settle for talking to boring, living politicians when you can chat with the legends of the past? But the castles were his real masterpiece. Neuschwanstein is the one everyone knows, the inspiration for the Disney castle, but it was never meant to be seen by the public. It was a private stage for his own imagination. Inside, he had a grotto built, an artificial cave made of plaster and wire, with a waterfall and a lake. He would have his servants row him around in a boat shaped like a giant gilded swan while he hummed opera tunes to himself. It's a bit tragic, really. He was a man with the resources of an entire nation, and he used them to build a literal bubble. The Bavarian government eventually grew tired of their king spending all the money on swan boats and plaster caves. They decided he was insane, though many historians think he was just eccentric and deeply depressed. They sent a commission of doctors to kidnap him from his castle and bring him to a smaller, more secure estate. A few days later, Ludwig was found dead in the shallow waters of Lake Starnberg, along with the doctor who had diagnosed him. To this day, nobody knows exactly what happened. Did he try to escape? Was it a murder? Or did the Moon King simply decide that since he couldn't live in his dream world, he didn't want to live in the real one anymore? As we leave the quiet, haunted shores of Lake Starnberg, we're going to float away from the mountains and toward the cold, windswept plains of Russia. We're moving from a king who built castles to a family that was trapped in a palace of their own making, a dynasty that was slowly being undone by its own blood. We're heading toward the Romanovs in the strange, hushed world of the last Tsar. Part 3: The Hushed Halls of the Alexander Palace. So we leave the cold, so quiet mystery of Lake Starnberg behind. The echoes of Wagner's operas fade into the distance, and we're drifting eastward. The air is getting sharper now, smelling of wood smoke and old snow. We're arriving in Russia at the dawn of the 20th century, specifically at the Alexander Palace. This was the preferred home of Tsar Nicholas II and his wife, Alexandra. Now, if you were to look at the Romanovs from the outside, you'd see the most powerful couple on earth. They ruled over 1/6 of the world's land. They had jewels that could buy entire cities and palaces that seemed to go on for miles. But inside the walls of the Alexander Palace, the vibe was anything but powerful. It was a place of heavy curtains, whispered conversations, and a constant suffocating sense of anxiety. The story of the last Romanovs is a classic example of what happens when dynastic purity meets biological reality. Nicholas and Alexandra were cousins, both grandchildren of Queen Victoria, and while they were genuinely in love, which was rare for royals, they had also inherited a very specific, very hidden piece of genetic code. When their son, Alexei, was born in 1904, the empire went wild with joy. Finally, a male heir. But the celebration didn't last. They soon discovered that Alexei had hemophilia, the royal malady. Because of a quirk in his DNA, his blood wouldn't clot. A simple bump on the knee wasn't just a bruise. It was a life-threatening internal hemorrhage that could leave him screaming in pain for weeks. This diagnosis turned the Russian Empire into a sleepy tragedy. To protect the boy's secret and the image of a strong monarchy the family withdrew from the world, they became the ultimate shut-ins. Nicholas, a man who famously preferred a quiet walk in the woods to a meeting with his ministers, used the family crisis as an excuse to ignore the crumbling world outside his gates. Imagine the Tsar of all the Russias sitting in his study, meticulously organizing his stamp collection or recording the exact temperature of the afternoon while a revolution was brewing just down the road. He wasn't being cruel, he was just overwhelmed. He was a man with a middle management personality who had been given the job of an absolute autocrat. And then there was Alexandra. Desperate to save her son, she turned away from science and toward the mystical. This is how we get the arrival of Rasputin, the mad monk with the unwashed beard and the piercing eyes. To the Russian public, Rasputin was a symbol of corruption and filth. But to Alexandra, he was the only man who could stop her son's bleeding. The palace became a fortress of superstition. While the rest of Europe was hurtling toward the modern age, the center of the Russian government was a room filled with incense and icons, where a peasant from Siberia whispered to a sickly boy. It's a bizarre, ironic contrast. An empire of millions, all dependent on the health of one small child and the influence of one strange man. As the years drifted by, the Romanovs became ghosts in their own land. They lived in a bubble of Victorian domesticity, drinking tea, playing billiards, and reading aloud to one each other while the Great War was tearing the world apart. When the end finally came in 1917, it almost felt like an interruption to their private, quiet life. Even in their final exile in Siberia, the family maintained their sleepy routine. Nicholas chopped wood. The girls helped in the kitchen. They seemed, in some strange way, relieved to be away from the throne. They were finally just a family, even if the world around them was on fire. But as we leave the snowy silence of the Russian plains, we're going to float back toward Western Europe, to a family that managed to survive the collapse of empires, but couldn't survive their own internal oddities. We're moving toward the gilded misfits of the British aristocracy, specifically a duke who took the idea of staying inside to its absolute literal limit. We're heading to Welbeck Abbey to meet the man who lived underground. We've drifted away from the cold, tragic silence of the Russian plains. The heavy velvet curtains of the Alexander Palace are fading into the mist, and we're floating back across the map over the choppy North Sea and settling into the rolling green countryside of Nottinghamshire, England. We're arriving at Welbeck Abbey. From the outside, it looks like your typical grand English estate. Stately stone, sprawling lawns, and the kind of quiet that only old money can buy. But tonight, we aren't staying on the surface. We're going down. We're here to meet William Cavendish Scott Bentinck, the 5th Duke of Portland. Now, if Ludwig of Bavaria was the Moon King, then the Duke of Portland was the Mole Duke. He was a man who took the concept of social distancing and turned it into an architectural masterpiece nearly a century before it was a trend. The Duke was an incredibly wealthy man, inheriting a fortune that most people couldn't even fathom. But he had a slight problem. He absolutely, fundamentally loathed being seen. It wasn't just shyness, it was a total, visceral commitment to being a ghost in his own life. He was the ultimate sleepy eccentric, a man who had all the power in the world and used it to build a labyrinth where no one could find him. If you were a servant at Welbeck Abbey, you lived by a very specific set of rules. The most important one: never, under any circumstances, acknowledge the Duke's existence. If you saw him coming down a hallway, you were expected to dive behind a curtain or hide in a cupboard. If you made eye contact, you were fired. He even had a special pit built in the middle of his library so he could descend into the basement if he heard someone coming. Because he hated the noise of human interaction, the Duke decided to move his entire life underground. He hired thousands of local workmen, at one point over 15,000 of them, to dig. They spent years carving out miles of tunnels beneath the estate. These weren't dark, damp burrows. They were grand, whitewashed corridors lit by thousands of gas jets. There was an underground library that was over 150 feet long. There was a subterranean ballroom that was so vast it could hold 2,000 people, though the Duke never once held a party there. He just liked the idea of a space that large, where he could be completely alone. He even had an underground carriage tunnel that stretched for a mile and a half, allowing him to travel to the local train station without ever having to breathe the same air as the commoners. Imagine the scene: a black carriage with the curtains drawn tight, rattling through a gaslit tunnel beneath the English soil, carrying a man who was wearing 3 pairs of trousers because he was always cold. It's the ultimate monotone commute. His communication style was just as bizarre. He didn't speak to his staff, he wrote notes. He had a double mailbox system installed in his bedroom door, one for incoming messages, one for outgoing. He even had his meals delivered on a miniature railway system that ran from the kitchen to his private dining room. He'd hear the little clack, clack, clack of the train, open the hatch, take his chicken and biscuits, and send the empty plates back into the darkness. The Duke's life was a masterpiece of avoidance. While the Victorian world was obsessed with progress, industry, and social standing, he was obsessed with the silence of the earth. He stripped his rooms of furniture, preferring bare floorboards and empty space. He was a minimalist before it was cool, living a life of monastic simplicity inside a billion-dollar hole in the ground. When he died in 1879, the world finally got a glimpse into his underground kingdom. They found miles of empty tunnels, a ballroom that had never seen a dance, and a man who had successfully spent millions of pounds to make sure he was never bothered by a good morning. And so, our long, quiet journey comes to a close. We've seen the Londoners who were overwhelmed by their own stink, the king who hid in a fairy tale castle, the czar who sought peace in a stamp collection, and the duke who lived like a mole. It seems that history is often just a collection of people trying to find their own version of quiet. Some build tunnels, some build castles, and some just hold their breath and wait for the smell to pass. The gas lamps in the tunnels are flickering out now. The snow has finally stopped falling over the palaces, and the Thames has long since been tamed by the bricks of the engineers. The stories have all been told. The monologues have reached their end, and the weight of the past is settling back into the earth. The world is still. The ghosts are back in their libraries, and the monarchs have finally found the rest they were looking for. You've done enough for today. Let the stories fade into the background and let yourself sink into the silence. Good night. When you wake up, I'll be here if you'd like to explore more of the world's quiet corners. Sweet dreams.